All right, jumping into Staffy. So we've been talking, we're always talking different leadership constructs and all the rest of it, but I guess something that I wanted to talk about before we even talk about how to do leadership and maybe some leadership, ideals that are for our house and beyond or whatever. I kind of just wanted to maybe put some statements, 10 points as to why leadership. Because I think it's sometimes one thing to learn how to do something, but do you even desire it? You know what I mean? Like, what's the point? There's a lot of myths and stereotypes around leadership. Like, oh, it's a burden. It's lonely. It's difficult. Well, I don't know if you want to sign up for that. And I just was thinking, well, why would somebody want it? You know what I mean? Like, outside of the fact that you're called to it, like, why do you want leadership? And what does it offer both you and the people you lead? And so I've just got 10 points there. Kind of to me, this has been my experience with leadership. It's what I have learned. And I'm learning, and these are the 10 reasons I think that we should all pursue leadership. And it's out of our pursuit of leadership that we then choose, and I think get on the journey of getting better at leadership. I don't think there's, I think it's just the thing you're always in pursuit of. And I kind of say that as well because I was on Tuesdays in college, I'm teaching on organizational structure, and it's like it's a tool for a leader, right? But I was thinking about it, and I was like, man, I wonder how many people even want to hear this in a sense, because it's like only something that might pique your interest if you have leadership problems. You know what I mean? It's kind of like I was giving the analogy that when Gio and I bought homes, like I've never once Googled about a lawn. I never cared about plumbing. I never wanted to know anything about tile. And then all of a sudden you buy a home and you're like, man, I'm so intrigued on how someone does these things. And it was like my number one most searched item. And it's because your need and your problems often actually develop your appetite for the answers you're seeking. And I think I kind of am trying to possibly bring reasoning and a bit of an igniting as to why leadership. Because I think a lot of people have leadership aversions. There's, I'll do anything other than lead. There's the reluctant leader, which is like, I'll lead, but like I'd rather be not seen and not heard and not present. To all you reluctant leaders, can I just speak to you for a second? I get it. It sounds awesome. It sounds humble. It sounds like it might be achievable. But in my experience, reluctant leadership hurts more people than it helps them. Because when you're a reluctant leader that's constantly hiding, but people are looking for someone to follow, it actually gets translated as if it's rejection. It gets translated as a lack of care. It gets translated as apathetic. And what it does is actually, whilst it might preserve the leader's comforts, it actually causes detriment to the thing they lead. So a apprehensive leader and a reluctant leader is a reluctant leader is a thing. An apprehensive leader is one who takes the seat of leadership but doesn't want it and tries everything to not fill it. A reluctant leader will always try to default and defer to everybody else in the room and really becomes a facilitator of decisions but not a decision maker. And the problem with a apprehensive leader is that what they do is they force big decisions on people's shoulders that weren't meant to carry them. They force big decisions on people's shoulders that weren't meant to carry them. And what they do is they create conjecture, they create divide, and they create actual problems, because rather than playing in the position that God has them, they force others to fill that position because they think what they're doing is maybe being the most political, most kind of, listening kind of a person that they're meant to be. Now, a leader's job is to listen, but the difference between being a good listener and still knowing that you've got to make the decision comes from somebody who embraces the seat rather than constantly tries to reluctantly apprehensively kind of fulfill it. An apprehensive leader ends up creating a whole bunch of problems. And these are some of the things I see a lot. So I was like, well, how do we maybe in this Staffy talk to a point where maybe we can correct it? Maybe you can actually embrace this from a better ideological and philosophical approach. And that's what we're talking about here today, really. An ideological, philosophical approach. If you're new to Starford, it's a leadership talk, so not always from the Bible. Sometimes it's practicals to the day-to-day of hosting, running, leading, and looking after a community of believers. None of them in conflict with the word, but not all of them always derive from a piece of scripture. So here are my 10 things that I've found that have become a good why for leadership. Number one, because it is the answer to your limitations.
That's good.
A lot of leadership is not just to, it's through. Leadership is not getting people to something quite often. Leadership is often got another element that is just as important as the to, and it's the through. The ability to lead through people gives you extensive reach. It actually starts to break down limitations of your gifting, the construct of time, the element of visibility, knowledge, experience. Leadership for me has extended reach and helped me break through limitations. If I'm limited in my strategy, if I'm limited in my time, if I'm limited in my understanding, if I'm limited in my awareness, leadership is the ability. I think the reason I love leadership is because it breaks limitations. The other thing about leadership is it breaks the limitations of the organization, of the church, of the team, because through good leadership, what we start to see is that it actually helps people go further and break their limits.
Yeah, very good.
Yes.
And I think it's one of the most rewarding and most encouraging things that we could do for people and for ourselves is to embrace leadership, because it removes limitations for everybody involved and the very thing that they're running towards. I think in order to do that, sometimes you definitely got to embrace that idea. We kind of spoke on Sunday about Jesus challenging the Pharisees in chapter 5 of John, and he's pretty ruthless. And I was like, he's not being nice. And then I kind of said, sometimes the nicest thing you can do is not be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And what I mean by nice, there's a bit difference between nice and good. The nice response isn't always a good response. Good is good for someone. Good is good for the team. Good is good for the kingdom. Good is good for the child. Good is good for the marriage. Good is good. It brings with it a wealth of good things: grace, mercy, goodness, growth, compassion. And the most compassionate thing is not always the nice thing.
Yeah. Come on.
Nice is what makes people feel nice and feel good, but what is good for someone is often not nice. It's not nice to tell someone that maybe like they've got to change an aspect or an attribute, or that they're rude, or that they need to grow in an area. It might not be nice to tell someone they need deodorant. It might not be nice to do these things, but it is actually good.
Right.
And I think we live in a culture that definitely filters the value of a statement based on how nice it is.
Yeah.
Good. Wow, so good.
But nice doesn't do something for people. And what I think leadership does is, I think leadership sometimes attacks what is not nice in order to bring what is good. And in that bringing what is good, it breaks limitations. And I think one thing I've loved about leadership is it's broken my limitations.
Yeah.
And it's broken my limits of my compassion. I had a limit in my compassion, and then having to lead more people meant I had to care for the person, lead people, not things.
That's good.
We often lead objectives and forget that you got to lead people, and you got to lead them to a better day. And leading someone to a better day means you quite often have to understand and feel their worst day.
Yeah.
And so where I had limitations in compassion, where I had limitations in self-awareness, leadership broke my limitations in self-awareness, because I started to realize, oh, this isn't growing because of me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I keep hurting people. Oh, I'm unorganized. And my lack of organization is ruining everybody else's ability. When you embrace leadership, you definitely embrace the pursuit of breaking limitations. And it starts in the idea of, I love the Bible, how it talks about the soul processes, the body processes, the soul processes, go out into Judea, Samaria, and the outermost parts of the world, not two connected verses, but connected ideas. That health starts from the inside, impact starts from the inside and goes out.
Yeah.
And I think the concentric extended circles of influence and impact in this first statement is that because you embrace leadership, I think you start to break the limitations in your soul, in your identity, in your thinking, in yourself. Then you break the limitations of your team, and then you break the limitations of your organization. And a healthy, flowing organization in any sector, or a healthy, kingdom-minded church, is going to break the limitations of a city.
Yeah.
Great, yes.
Yeah.
Second one is this: because it will happen by default, but it's better by design. Like, leadership's going to happen by default, but it's always better by design. You can't help but be leading somewhere.
Yeah.
You're going somewhere, whether you like it or not. You're leading somewhere, and whether you like it or not, someone's following you. You know what I mean? Like, it's just happening. And I think sometimes what it does is the understanding that it's by default or by design actually stops us from being selfish. And what I mean by that is when I realize that leadership, if we're going to start from the outside circles in, is actually stops me from being selfish because it's by default or by design, I started to realize that the things I do have an impact on the people watching.
Yeah.
And that if the things I do have an impact on the people watching, I'm always leading. And where am I leading people to? So even when I moved on from different seasons of teams or jobs or whatever it was, I was always aware that the way I do this is either going to lead people with me away from something, or it's going to lead them to something. And I remember moving on when Ords and I got called to start our church, this church, and not ours, but this church, it's God's, and we all lead it together. And that's not me being like, it's all to him, but it's what I genuinely believe. It's not mine, it's his bride. But when Ords and I got called to lead the church, People Church, I remember our church we came from was going through a real turbulent time. And a lot of people were asking us, hey, what do you think? Should I leave? Should I go? Like, what should we do? And I remember kind of sitting there thinking to myself, well, I can't, what am I going to tell you? I've got nothing to offer you. And what I say is going to create a directive in your life. And at the end of the day, what I don't say is going to create something. So default, am I serving the kingdom? If I say nothing and do not use my seat of leadership, am I doing something? I'm still doing something. They're going to come to their own conclusions, maybe not inspired, not educated. Maybe I'm there to affirm what God's been speaking to them. But by design, I realize I have a seat, I have an influence, and I got to lead people somewhere, because selfishly, I can think I'm not, but selfishly, I always am. People are going to be following. So I remember saying, listen, you've got to go to God. I can't give you answers that God's meant to give you. Might not be the answer they wanted, but it was an answer that I think was fair, true, and embraced the ideal of this is going to happen. I get to either do it by design or by default.
Very good.
When we lead by default, we have no control and rarely like the outcome.
Yeah.
When we lead by design, it gives us a measure. It is the beginning point of growth, because to aim at something gives us the opportunity to evaluate, and evaluation creates iteration, and iteration creates growth.
Very good.
The fact that we do choose the leadership of default, it limits us. And that's why I'm saying design is better. So you're going to lead anyway. You're going to lead in your marriage. You're going to lead up the chain, down the chain. You're going to always lead. And when you lead by default, you rarely like it. You often will sit there having to bear the consequence of it. And leading by default, in my experience, it's like digging a hole. It only gets deeper. Whereas leading by design is an opportunity to make decisions, even albeit if they are a subset of decisions that none of them seem good, you get the opportunity for the best. When you lead by design, you actually shape something. When you lead by design, you will enjoy it. When you lead by design, you get intentional. When you aim at something, you're going to grow. And I know that aiming at nothing gives the appearance of a lack of failure, but a lack of leading is failure in and of itself. And it is one of the worst failures. And if we're going to talk about, even from a biblical perspective, on the default mentality, let's talk about the parable of the talents. 2 got active. They led by design. 1 led by default. I'm going to bury this, and I'm just going to sit back. I'm going to see what happens here. When you come back, you at least have what you were given. And obviously we know how that went. And for those that haven't read that verse, you will read that basically the master was absolutely furious, and he, said to the wicked servant that he was lazy and that he was cast into where there was weeping and gnashing of teeth. Like, it's a parable about salvation, I believe, and what we do with it. But I think what is at the heart of the framework of this man was fear, not knowing his actual master, and thirdly, a spirit of default. But if we can first assess the first two, fear and a lack of knowing gave birth to default. Fear and a lack of knowing creates a paralyzing effect. And when paralyzed, we take our hands off because we would rather, out of fear of failure, we would rather the something falls apart by default. Because somehow we think, I didn't have anything to do with it. But if you had the ability to catch the vase before it dropped and shattered, and you didn't, you are still by design at fault.
Wow.
And I think we sit by a lot because of our ideological and philosophical approaches to leadership, that default is that we didn't do it. But if you observed it with the responsibility, the ability to respond, and you didn't, you caused. You contributed. You enabled. You allowed. And so a lot of the things we don't want in our life are because we actually embrace this idea of leadership by default. When the reality is that leadership by design, even if you are by your own self-professed measure a terrible designer, is better on its worst day than leadership by default is on its best day. Your leadership by design is better on its worst day than your leadership by default is on its best day. Number 3, because it is fulfilling to pour in and not only take out. Why leadership? I don't know. I just love pouring in. And I wasn't always like that, but pouring in is like an addictive drug. Because it feeds an aspect of our soul that maybe as humans we're not taught is even an appetite that exists. But it is definitely an appetite that can be awoken. And just as Jesus by the well speaks to the fact that he's got food that they know not of, and it was the works of the Father, and as he does that, that interaction does something. I preached on it on Sunday. There is something about leadership that will do more for you than any taking could ever fulfill within you. So when you lead, why lead? Because you get to pour into people. Yeah. Why lead? Because you get to love on someone. Why lead? Because you get to speak life where there's been death. Why lead? Because you put a smile on someone's face where there was a frown or they were sad. Why lead? Because you unlock someone's destiny.
Yes.
Why lead? Because it does something to pour in. And I found one of my earliest revelations that God, it was one of my first encounters with the Holy Spirit and a teaching moment. I was sitting in my room and I was coming down off the high of becoming a Christian. It was like, at first you're like, dang, this is real. Dang, he answers prayers. Dang, that happened. Whoa. I remember my first few weeks of leadership. Like, I think this super well-known evangelist was coming in called Reinhard Bonnke. I didn't know who the heck he was. I was just like, man, this guy's got a voice that is a gravel pit for the kingdom. It's like, I was like, it's amazing. And then they show this part where, like, at one of his crusades, he prays for a dead man. The dead man comes to life, and I'm just watching all these Christians like, and I'm like, is what? And this man's coming, like, so this is my first snapshot of Christianity, right? Like, I'm getting saved. God's moving. He's speaking. Reinhard Bonnke is a person, and he's raising the dead. I'm like, this is amazing. And then all of a sudden, that starts to die off, and I'm starting to be like, I don't feel what I felt. I don't feel it. The messages aren't hitting like they used to. Church, I'm not as excited for it as I used to, and I don't really want to read my word like I wanted to, and I don't find prayer time to be earth-shattering anymore. And like, God, what's happening? And I feel like God just said, everything's coming in and nothing's going out. And what I started to realize that week, God obviously is amazing. A preacher spoke about the Dead Sea, how it's the lowest point on earth and everything flows in and nothing flows out, and therefore it's dead and nothing grows around it and nothing lives in it. And God started to speak to me that I had this receive mentality. And it's quite often because, one, without Jesus, we live at a deficit. We grow up being served, from the moment we come out the womb, it is a take. And we don't understand or even awaken the reality that most of our hunger is not from what we need to eat, but what we need to give. And if you want to be nourished, the thing about pouring in and what it does for you is that it nourishes a side of you that without that nourishment will not be utilized, awakened, or strengthened. And quite often, that part of you that is lacking in your everyday, which would make for a more complete you, it needs the proverbial, if you will, it's not even a proverb, but protein that feeds the muscles that only pouring in get fed by. And what I kind of mean by that is like, man, again, to the default statement, it's been so long that I've been in the gym and I'm finally getting back and I'm at such a deficit that I find I've got to do just building exercises of small muscles before I can even get to the big muscles, because like the connecting muscles, and they've deteriorated because I've not done anything with it. But then everyday tasks start to become a thing. And it's not because you're old. There's a difference between old and inactive. And like all of a sudden I'm finding that, this now has to happen. And I think that a lot of us go through life and we want passion in our marriages and we want passion in our relationships and we want compassion for our children and we want to be able to make tough calls on things. But that muscle is awoken and fed by the pouring in. And just as muscles need protein and creatine and, I think omega somethings and aminos and all the rest of it in order to grow, like I think your spirit, your leadership, everything there is a part of you that is lying dormant if you do not feed you what you need, and what you need is to pour out.
Yeah, very good.
You will grow familiar with your old revelations. You'll grow familiar with the great environments you're in. You'll grow familiar with the opportunity to lead that is in front of you if you do not pour in. But when you pour in, you start to remember, oh, this tastes good. You pour in, you're like, oh, I like this. This actually fulfills me and completes me. And what a beautiful thing to be completed by completing others.
Come on.
It is a great thing to lead because it is fulfilling to actually pour in and not only take out. Number 4, because it is better to go further later than nowhere faster. I choose leadership because it is better to go further later than nowhere faster. And faster might get you to some milestones quicker, but without leadership, milestones cannot be retained.
Yeah.
And so whilst you feel like you reach goals, you actually also revert back to starting lines.
Very good.
Without leadership, you will go faster and you will reach goals, but you'll also revert back to starting lines. Which means that if it is gained and it is lost, it's no longer gained. So it is better to go slower because pouring into people takes time. You got to get good at it. They got to get good at it. You got to learn how to speak their language. They got to learn how to speak yours. They've got to grow. You got to grow. It's a thing.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what, as you pour into people, you might take longer, but you'll go further. And the further you go, you'll also get faster.
Yeah.
So then you get the benefits of fast and far because you took the time to actually lead. Leadership is better because although it's not faster at the beginning, it goes further and faster at the end.
Yeah, very good.
And I think a lot of people love the illusion of nowhere fast because they don't realize that fast isn't finished.
Right. Yeah. Right.
You might get there, but and you know where I learned this? So when we started the church, last week I spoke about, I think one of my points was use what you have to get where you need to go. Or I said this in college night. And our approach was always like, well, man, we don't have leaders and we don't have money. So I can't build our church on a style of groups. I don't have that, right? But I was like, man, what can we do? I was like, it's easy to teach people how to stand on a door and wave. It's easy to get some singers. It's easier to get someone to turn on some lights on and off. It's like, we can do that. We can create a service and hopefully that'll attract people. And as we attract people, we can turn them into something. I still stand by that strategy. It was the only and best one we had. However, it made me appreciate how much we needed the next portion of leaders because we started to grow. We ran the play that we know how to run. We did it in our youth ministry. And we started, not a really good launch, but I think in that year we had over 450 in a service once. And those 450, we lost them straight away. Because 450 people, you could get them to watch something, but they're only going to stay if there's someone to connect to. And so what we started to do was, well, this is a little bit like difficult. And what we realized was, we could get to big numbers fast. But without leadership, we'll never retain them. Can I say the worst statement a leader could ever live by or choose to embrace or say is simply this. If you want it done well, do it yourself. I would add to that statement, if you want it done well, do it yourself. And if you want to do it forever, do it yourself. Number 5, because it is the difference between legacy and wasted effort. When you lead, a part of you leads and lives on. When you lead, a part of you leads and lives on. A part of you is imparted. A part of you continues. When you lead, even if it's not about you and you're leading something like we all lead with Kingdom Legacy, what you lead creates and extends and passes the baton to more people than just yourself. If it's just you, and there's a difference between having workers and creating leaders. Workers will work towards your vision and what you're doing, and they will outwork your goals and what you want. But leaders will take what you do and either extend it, take it further, and replicate it and run it whilst you are there or not there or whatever it might be. And I think a lot of people think that legacies will be built because they've got staff. But a staff member will fulfill a task list. A leader will fulfill a vision. A staff member will go hard on tasks, policies. They'll do those things because they're there. But a leader will carry soul, will carry heart. A leader can think on the ground. A leader knows the heart, and a heart then knows how to interpret, curveballs and decisions out of left field. All of a sudden, they think as you think, speak as you speak, value what you value. And what do you value? Well, ultimately, we value what Jesus valued. We think as Jesus thought, hopefully. We try to tap into that as best as we can. And when we create leaders, we create people that can actually fulfill a role, stand in a gap, not simply bridge a gap and do a task. There is something incredible about the legacy that is left behind. And I don't know about you, but I embrace leadership because it has been my experience that even when I moved on from Sydney or moved on from the Gold Coast or moved on from different seasons, there are people still doing the same work and they're going out and they're going far. And honestly, what a privilege it is to play a role in actually releasing people into something more than simply your dream, your task, or what you do. And that happens when you take the time to teach people why, not what. This ideological shift on embracing leadership for this reason makes you teach people whys, not whats. Whats are easy. Whats come from an authoritative perspective. You do what I tell you to do, and you ask me how high and how far. But why means I've got to teach you, and then that means I've got to remove roadblocks, or I've got to wrestle things with you. And here's what I love about why. A why explained creates a sharper why for me and you. Because sometimes what I've learned in teaching somebody a why, I realize that my why was weak. Leadership will make you question your own why and sharpen it and strengthen it. Because there are times when people are like, why do we have to do it that way? And I'm like, actually, that's a really good question. I don't really, because we always did. It's just what we do. Shut up. And then you're like, well, that's not going to be any good. That doesn't work. And so you're like, oh, why do we do this? And you either come back with a better why, or it grows. And I think a lot of us has grown because we've been in meetings and people said, hey, why are we doing this? I've lost sight of it. Or why are we doing this? It doesn't work. Or why? And it's like, Man, it's so good. So I think that when you actually want to create legacy, you got to teach people why and not just what. Because what is a task carried out of have to, why always runs much deeper and leads into want to. Okay. Number 6, because it allows you and everyone involved to leverage gifts. I know that Audrey and I could never lead this by ourselves. We just can't. I think one of the biggest lies about leadership is, well, you guys, if you're at the top and you spurred on some of these growth points and the people that you lead, then obviously you could do it by yourself, right? Because you're the ones leading them. And the reality is, no, man, I think you got a lifeline going. You know, you got a small amount of time where you can carry this thing by yourself, and if people don't jump on board, you're screwed. And I think the whole thing about leadership is that you get to enjoy, leverage, and all benefit from each other's gifts. I love the Bible in Acts 2:42, the believers create a community. It says they had all things in common. It's not talking about the fact that they all went and bought the same sweater and they all bought the same. No, it meant that they were thinking, there was a unity. And I think leadership, for me, why would I do it? Because, man, I'm not good enough to do it by myself. And it's not even fun.
That's real.
I remember my favorite times in this church and any team I've been a part of is not when I've been able to play the role of the star or anything of that nature. It's so not fulfilling. But when you're all synergistically humming and buzzing, and man, you're watching Sandra do her thing, and Courtney's doing hers, and Brianna Ford's doing hers, and Nick James and Jared's doing his, and Gio, and like everyone's just rolling, and Katori's doing his thing. Like, man, you just feel like, whoa, this is unstoppable. It's fun. Because it also allows you to not despise the gifts you don't have, because you're frustrated with what you can't do. You actually, as you lead, get to embrace the gifts you do have. And you get to thrive in it. It's fun to do what you do well. So I think, why leadership? Because you get to leverage gifts. Okay. Number 7, because it holds an exponential return. If you lead, man, you start a chain reaction that will not stop. So why leadership? Because, man, it's horrible to keep plate spinning yourself. But man, when you lead, it's awesome to watch it just keep going. You know, I was going to say this with what Xavier was saying, but man, I was so proud of all of the leaders of this house at last growth track, week 2. I came home and I told Oz, I was like, man, Oz, I wish you were there to see it. You missed such a milestone in the vision of this church. Like, I was watching a full packed house. And then when we do this segment where about like 22 of you all get up there and you give a short stint on why your team, and it is hilarious and it is awesome. But man, can I just tell you, I was like, wow, God, thank you. Man, I'm so proud of every one of those 22 people, every one of them. If I was sitting in a church and saw that level of leadership, that deep and that wide, I would just be like, wow, I'm in. What's going on here? Every single one of you that explained something was just like, I would follow them. I would lead. I would be on their team. And, you know, I think that that's the beauty of this, right? Like, I remember just coming off the back of pandemic and, you know, just meeting people. And they're like, oh, yeah, I'm starting a grow group. And we're like, well, I'm just meeting you. That's awesome. Like, how cool is that? And I think there's the beauty of this moving beyond us. Okay, number 8, because if you can reproduce and teach people to reproduce, you have started a chain reaction. Ties into number 7, won't go into it. Number 9, because it sets a self-correcting culture. When you lead, you're not the only one that has to lead. When you embrace leadership, other people lead with you. I heard this, I think it was Jordan Peterson said, you know, one of the myths of having a big family is that you're going to do it all by yourself, but, you know, the kids raise each other, help each other. It all becomes a family unit, and I think it's a beautiful thing. And I got to say that there's a lot of leaders that say, man, and because of hurt, it's vulnerable being a leader sometimes, you know, and things happen. And so they just start to let their wounds shape them and their leadership. And they start to lead from a distance because their first taste of leadership had a bit of, you know, turbulence. And then all of a sudden what you end up doing is you're the only one feeding the children, so to speak. But man, when you lead, it becomes correcting culture, and people pull each other up and pull each other out, and it's awesome. So it is much better than doing it by yourself. And number 10, because it provides the skill to translate dreams and initiatives into reality. Leadership will give you the skills you need to take concepts to fruition.
Yeah.
Leadership will teach you how to, all the ins and outs of it. And that's so awesome, because I think it is one of the most torturous things to have nothing but a dream, because it's an unfilled desire and something that would be fulfilling that is left in the realm of nothing more than hope. Mm-hmm. But when you learn that actually bringing something to reality is a gift of leadership, because all of these things come into play, and I think all these 10 things are what's needed to take an idea from an idea to a reality, from a concept to an experience, to a dream, to something that you get to live. So these have been my experiences. I've heard a lot over the years of how difficult leadership is. I've chosen, and it has been my experience, that when leadership feels difficult, I need to get before God.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's often something has to die in me, something needs to heal in me, something needs to grow in me.
Yeah.
Leadership is not fun when I'm not doing it well. Golf is not fun when I'm hitting the grass and not the ball, Like, it's not that golf's not fun, it's that I'm not doing it right.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's I got to heal. Running's not fun sometimes if you've got a niggling injury. It's not that running's the problem, it's that you need to heal. You know what I mean? And I think that there's just certain elements that this is done in me. And I think leadership is actually, when you're healthy, it is fun, it is rewarding, it is good, it lessens the load. It is just an incredible endeavor to take. So if you have been wondering, or you've been a reluctant leader, or you've been someone that doesn't want to kind of do it, I hope that these things speak to you, because I'll tell you what, it has been the best part of what I do in life, is leading both my children and my family, leading with my wife, leading our church, and leading with our church is just the best thing I've ever done. So
Great.
that is our staffing. We've got some minutes if you want to ask me, or maybe there's someone in this room that you might look at and go, and digitally, that you might go, man, they just seem to lead effortlessly. What's their motivation? Man, open it up. You can ask them. We can utilize these last 6 minutes before we go eat our lunch. If not, we have one. Brianna?
Question going back to the reality of, maybe having wounds coming through at leadership. Like, what would you say like the best thing you could do once you uncover that in your leadership?
Yeah, I think for me, I always ask myself, first thing I ask is, when did this wound start? Like, where did it come from? Because there's a difference between the wound coming from leadership and leadership pressing on a pre-existing wound. So there's that. The second thing I ask myself is, why did this wound me? Sometimes a wound is not this, I find this totalitarian, it's not the same as a physical wound sometimes. Like, a physical wound is 1 + 1 = 2. You take a knife, you put it to your skin, you're going to have a cut. But I find that internal wounds are really determined based on our previous index of definitions. And what I mean by index of definitions is, we have learned that somebody not responding to us or not liking our ideas is that they don't really love us, or maybe that we don't really hold worth, or maybe somebody rejecting an idea already leverages an insecurity that you don't have good ideas. So like, understanding why that wound wounded me is one of the first things that heals. And I think you have to, so if you have a really deep flesh wound, they actually pack it because it has to close from the bottom all the way up. And I think what we do in leadership sometimes is we try to stitch from the top without addressing the deep wounds that need to be packed.
Very good.
And so what I have kind of learned is that in those moments where there's this wound, I then go to the inside and I start to deal with what value system and ideal in me actually creates a vulnerability to this action that I'm probably going to come up against a lot in ministry that is wounding me, but intrinsically really shouldn't.
Right.
even if we speak about people walking off teams or walking away from us or rejecting the faith or rejecting church, well, the reality of that is that Jesus was himself rejected, and he said if they hated him, they're going to hate us. And yet not a ideal that we embrace. And then you've got to also then go, okay, is this scalable? In essence, is this good philosophy? So, for example, is everybody walking away just because they're rejecting the faith, the church, or us? Sometimes, but not always. So we might have some comfort in that portion of the reality, but now we got to go into well, what if it's because I'm not doing a good job? And how do I better regulate that? Well, then what do? I embraced a different ideal that sat well with me and healed a lot in me, which was, well, then I'm going to invite conversation based on frameworks of what is logical, what is fair, and what is biblical. And so if somebody brings something to me and through that framework, it's exposed that I need to grow, or I was in the wrong or partially in the wrong, man, it's good. And then I had to go one step deeper, and it was simply this. God then asked me, Chris, does being right and smart make you a good leader? And I said no, and I felt like the one thing that does make you a good leader is knowing when you're wrong and knowing how to elevate the best idea, not generating the best idea. Now this made me open to discussion, my previous point, which then removed the sensitivity to the wound, and what once cut me grew me.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you.
That's very good.
Well,
I have a question.
okay, lucky last.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Shayla. So I, yesterday was very overwhelming for me, like mentally and spiritually. And I couldn't really discern, like, was I walking like in my own strength? Like, is that why I felt so depleted? Or was I maybe not resting, like, spiritually throughout the day, like relying on God to help me? It was a lot going on, like physically yesterday, but then also just spiritually, a lot of things transpiring with different people. And so, like, I guess my question is, like, how do you determine if, like, when you're leading and when there is chaos all around you, how do you discern, like, if you're walking in your own strength versus if it's like, no, you're resting or you're doing the right things and you're trusting in God? It's just a lot going on and you're human. Like, I really couldn't tell which one it was yesterday, but it took me like a few hours to recover after I got home yesterday. So wanted some advice on that.
Yeah. I would say 3 quick things that come to mind for me and a process that I've run is 3 words: observe, discern, discuss. So I observe the circumstance and situation and I pull whatever I can pull at face value. Time change, I'm growing, things are growing, that's going to pull strain on me. Man, I got into a fight with my mum before I walked in the building. I just observe. The next thing is I discern. Okay, Holy Spirit, God, search my heart. What is it that is happening right now? Is this spiritual? Is this growth? Is it both? You'll often find that the devil's really good at pressing when you are needing to also process and grow. He waits till opportune times. Luke 4, he tested him in the wilderness, and then it says that he came back at the next opportune time. Oh, we gotta go. So, basically that, and then discuss. Go talk with leaders and trusted people that have good advice.
Great.
Shayla, you're awesome. Circle back if you need more.